Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Remember that admission to the museums is free every Sunday and includes the PBS Frontline special exhibit Unresolved, which draws on more than 2 years of reporting, thousands of documents, and dozens of first-hand interviews to examine the federal government's effort to investigate more than 150 civil rights-era cold cases under the authority of the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act. And then tune in next week for History's Lunch when we'll hear from Robert H. Meyer, who is the author of the forthcoming book, In the Name of Emmett Till, How the Children of the Mississippi Freedom Struggle Showed Us Tomorrow. Today, we're delighted to welcome Joshua Rothman, author of the new book, The Ledger and the Chain, How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America. Joshua D. Rothman is professor of history and chair of the University of Alabama Department of History. He earned his BA at Cornell University and his MA and PhD, both in history, from the University of Virginia. In addition to The Ledger and the Chain, Rothman is the author of Notorious in the Neighborhood, Sex and Families Across the Color Line in Virginia, 1787 to 1861, and Flush Times and Fever Dreams, a story of capitalism and slavery in the age of Jackson. Welcome, Joshua Rothman.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. I am going to go ahead and share my screen in just a second. I want to thank not only you, Chris, I want to thank the library for having me. Both this book and my last book, I spent a lot of time in Jackson doing research at the library. It's a great place to work. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it's nice to have the opportunity to share some of the results of the research with everyone on the line here. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I will go ahead and get started. What I want to do, does that look all right to you, Chris? Great. Okay. What I want to do today is take maybe 30, 35 minutes to tell you about the book I've recently published. And in brief, what the book does is tell the history of the domestic slave trading firm of Franklin and Armfield. And between 1828 and 1836, when the company was most active in the trade, it bought enslaved people from slaveholders in Maryland and Virginia, shipped them by sea along the Atlantic coast, or walked them hundreds of miles across the continent, and sold them mostly to cotton and sugar planters and to merchants in Louisiana and Mississippi. All told, the company was responsible for the long-distance forced migration of between 8,000 and 10,000 enslaved people. And that made it the largest domestic slave trading operation of its time, and probably the largest slave trading operation in American history. Now, it was definitely the most important trading operation in American history because the methods that the firm used, the volume it entailed, the money and the credit it kept in circulation, all of those things pushed ahead a transformation of the domestic slave trade, turning it from something that white men did mostly on a small scale as a temporary means of making extra cash into a profession, an ongoing concern, a big business that was integrated into national and global commodity and financial markets, something that had the potential for enormous profits for its operators, and of course, something that had devastating consequences for the enslaved. Now, the book uses a biographical approach to tell this story. It centers on the lives and careers of the three main partners in the firm: Issac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard. But the larger story that's traceable through the arcs of those lives and careers is, in fact, the long and hideous life of the domestic slave trade itself. I think too often we imagine the domestic slave trade as something that doesn't really have a life cycle. It doesn't really have a history. And what I mean by that is, obviously, everybody who's familiar with the slave trade understands that the trade is a thing of the past, and that it played an important role in the historical development of the nation and in the lives of the enslaved people trafficked in it. But we too rarely consider that the trade itself was not static. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't steady over time. It had a birth and a death. It ebbed and it flowed and it moved. Its rhythms and its size, those things fluctuated over the course of many decades in conjunction with the economic, political, and physical landscape of the United States. And so it's the weaving together of the biographies of Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard with the biography of the slave trade that is what the book ultimately aims to accomplish. And so that's what I want to try and outline for you this afternoon. And as is true of most life stories, it makes the most sense to begin at the beginning. The trade in enslaved people in the United States was as old as the United States itself. In fact, it predated the United States itself. Africans and their descendants were bought and sold in mainland North America from the moment they were first imported to Virginia in the early 17th century. Tens of thousands of people were taken into the domestic slave trade in the colonial era and into the early decades of the new republic. But to the extent that we're able to track it, it seems like the early domestic slave trade was limited, at least relative to what it would later become. And opportunities for slave traders were even more so. And there's several reasons for that. One is that through and after the American Revolution, slaveholders in places like South Carolina and Georgia met many of their labor demands by importing enslaved people from Africa and from the Caribbean. White migrants to Western territories and to new states like Kentucky and Tennessee, they tended to bring enslaved laborers with them when they moved. And in addition to those things, the American banking system in this era was immature. It was undercapitalized. And so when you added all of that together, what it meant is that obviously it was possible to be a slave trader in this era. But into the early 19th century, large professional slave trading businesses were nearly unheard of. Now, these circumstances really started to change in the decade or two after the closing of the legal transatlantic slave trade. Congress outlawed that trade in 1808, but it did nothing to limit domestic traffic in enslaved people. And so the ban on the transatlantic trade, what it actually does is it creates a protected and federally sanctioned market for the slave trade within the boundaries of the United States. And it did so precisely at a moment when labor demands were skyrocketing in the lower South. In that part of the country, which was expanding into portions of the continent that were acquired during the Louisiana Purchase, you had military and diplomatic victories over the British and numerous Indian nations during the War of 1812. And those victories then, in turn, provided security and market access for white farmers who saw economic possibilities in burgeoning sugar and cotton markets. And all of that, of course, made economic possibilities for slave traders. The number of enslaved people moved across state lines grew by 80% between the 1800s and the 1810s. It grew by another 25% between the 1810s and the 1820s. All told, in the first 30 years of the 19th century, nearly 350,000 enslaved people suffered forced migration in what historian Ira Berlin referred to as a second Middle Passage. Roughly 80% of those people, nearly 275,000 in total, were taken out of Maryland and Virginia, where a declining tobacco economy left slaveholders with so-called surplus laborers, who they put on the market for sale, and where a growing cadre of professional slave traders purchased those people for transport, mostly to Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Now, this is the era when Issac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard all entered the slave trade business. Now, Franklin was first, traveling from his native Tennessee through the mountains to the Chesapeake. He was just a teenager in 1808. but he was already working alongside his older brothers, bringing enslaved people over the Appalachians, putting them on flatboats, and sending them down the Mississippi River to Natchez and New Orleans for sale. Now, Franklin's brothers mostly got out of the slave trade after the War of 1812, but Franklin actually threw himself further into the trade. By the early 1820s, he was a well-established businessman in Natchez. He was well known to slaveholders in Maryland and Northern Virginia. Now, John Armfield, who was a native of North Carolina, and Ballard, who was a native of Virginia, both of those men were younger than Issac Franklin. And so neither of them ventured into the slave trade until the 1820s. Armfield turned to it after a brief stint running a mercantile business. Ballard got recruited into it by a wealthy patron, a plantation owner, a builder, a tavern keeper, a guy who was basically looking for someplace else to put his money to work. But both Armfield and Ballard took to the business very, very quickly. They enjoyed the hustle of it. They enjoyed the violence of it. And they determined there was enough money to be made in it such that they decided to devote their careers to it. Now, like most of the men who joined what might be called this first generation of professional slave traders, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard, they were working in an industry whose cruelty was boundless and whose number of players was expanding. But it was still a business that was kind of haphazard in the 1820s. Chesapeake slave traders in the early 19th century tended to be itinerants. They were men who often worked alone. They worked out of bars, hotels, taverns. They might put a newspaper announcement advertising that they wanted to purchase as many as several dozen slaves at a time. They left town when they had who they wanted, and they might then reappear months later, or they might never be seen again. They mostly moved people over land, chained into caravans known as coffles, or perhaps by flatboat down rivers. And when traders got to a market where they intended to make sales, they similarly found temporary locations, places where buyers could find them and where they could stash the black people who they brought for sale. Then they sold whoever they could, ideally for cash, and they left. Now, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard were all a little bit steadier than that. And what I mean by that is all three of them tended to return to the same markets year after year. And Franklin, by the middle of the 1820s, as I mentioned, he already had a regular sales location in Natchez. But still, all three of them were mostly gathering people for sale by working in taverns, loitering at estate and sheriff's auctions, following rumors about slaveholders in the countryside who might have financial problems that could be eased or solved by selling people they enslaved. Now, Franklin and Armfield first met in 1824. They got to know each other in the course of doing business a little bit. And in 1828, they came back together and they decided to join forces, to pool their money, to create a partnership, and to go into the slave trading business together. And they had something very different in mind from what they'd been doing up to that point. They went big right from the beginning. They staked what today was roughly the equivalent of about $500,000 between them. A few years later, they brought Rice Ballard into the operation as a third partner with a similarly sized stake. And the company that they built together marked the next stage in the evolution of America's domestic slave trade. And arguably, it was the most significant stage in that evolution. Now, there were a number of elements that set the company that was known as Franklin and Armfield apart from most of the slave trading businesses that preceded it. So for one thing, instead of working out of a bar or a tavern, they established regular places of business that served as headquarters, offices, and slave pens, all in one. John Armfield, for example, worked from a 3-story townhouse with an attached walled compound in Alexandria, Virginia. Rice Ballard worked out of a private jail in Richmond, Virginia. And Franklin, with the help of a nephew, worked sometimes out of his Natchez facility. And for a number of years, he also worked out of a facility that he rented in New Orleans. Another difference, instead of running newspaper advertisements sporadically, John Armfield was in Alexandria all year. He paid for advertisements that appeared in newspapers there and elsewhere in the District of Columbia every single day. He let customers know that he was available to buy slaves, that he wanted to purchase large numbers of people, that he would pay higher cash prices for those people than any other slave trader in the market, and that he could be found in his office whenever he was needed. Instead of walking maybe a few dozen people at a time over land or by flatboat, Franklin and Armfield instead accumulated as many as several hundred people at a time, working with a small army of agents and subagents who spread the company's money around the Chesapeake and thereby covered much more ground than Armfield or Ballard could possibly do alone. Those agents then brought all the people that they purchased and accumulated to Alexandria or to Richmond. And from those cities, John Armfield arranged to have most of those people sent by ship, as many as 200 people at a time, down the Atlantic coast, around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico, and up the mouth of the Mississippi River to New Orleans. In New Orleans, Issac Franklin received the shipments, sold some of the people who had come to him, and sent others farther upriver by steamboat to Natchez, where they would be sold there. So all told, this was a business that was organized, it was steady, it was efficient, it was reliable for customers, and it was unrelenting, absolutely pitiless when it came to the enslaved captives who were treated as merchandise. Now, it's worth noting that Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard did not invent these tactics all by themselves. There were a few other traders before them who had innovated this new kind of slave trading operation. Most notable among them was a man named Austin Woolfolk. Now, Austin Woolfolk, by the early 1820s, had a regular base of operations in Baltimore. He advertised widely from that base of operations. He oversaw a network of agents of his own. And most of those agents for Woolfolk were relatives. They were cousins, uncles, brothers. Working primarily in Maryland, Woolfolk's agents accumulated enslaved people who were then shipped from Baltimore to New Orleans. Other Woolfolk relatives would be there in that city and then selling them from an office in Louisiana. But within a few years of creating their company, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard, they bypassed Woolfolk. They edged him aside. They cut so deeply into his business that Woolfolk started having to combat rumors that he had in fact died. Now, in part, they did that by doing everything Austin Woolfolk did, but they did it bigger. They did it better. The headquarters that John Armfield ran in Alexandria, for example, it was massive. Took up half a city block. It became a kind of tourist attraction in its own right, particularly for anti-slavery activists who wanted to see and report on how slavery and the slave trade worked in America's capital. And Alexandria was then part of Washington, D.C. The network of agents that Franklin and Armfield oversaw, meanwhile, was much more extensive than Austin Woolfolk's. Ultimately, their network of agents covered over 20,000 square miles of Maryland and Virginia. And when it came to shipping, Franklin and Armfield became so big and so successful that in time they purchased 3 brigs of their own, operating it as a small company fleet. At the peak of the company's operations in the middle of the 1830s, John Armfield was sending one of the company's ships to New Orleans filled with enslaved captives every 2 weeks. And he often supplemented company earnings by bringing things back to the Chesapeake on those ships for local merchants: sugar, cotton, iron, other sorts of items that they wanted to sell. Now, some of what made Franklin and Armfield so successful was that all three partners were very shrewd businessmen. They understood and made no pretense, for example, about the intimate brutalities that were necessary to make the slave trade work. They knew that the slave trade had no room for sentimentality. It had no room for scruples, particularly when it came to the enslaved. They understood that violence was endemic to stealing people away from their homes and forcing them to accept what was happening to them. And they understood that all that really mattered about an enslaved person was whether they could be sold for a profit. All three men, in other words, were very skilled at calibrating their cruelty and assessing the market value of human beings. They also understood the financial considerations that pertain to the slave trade. John Armfield had a knack for overseeing and coordinating the complicated logistics of purchasing and shipping the enslaved, and for providing dependability for customers. Issac Franklin had a particular kind of genius for integrating enslaved people with money markets and credit flows. He understood that the stature of his company, the volume in which it dealt, that could provide access to borrowed capital. Borrowed capital, as Franklin saw it, would pay off much more handsomely over the long haul than quick cash sales that most slave traders relied on and looked for. And so Franklin established credit lines with banks from New Orleans to New York that let the company sell slaves in the lower South for commercial paper. Franklin then transmitted that paper back east, where Armfield and Ballard turned it into cash using their own network of banks. And then they pumped that cash back into purchasing networks. All of this was a very intricate undertaking. But the better Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard became at handling both the violence and the money, the more solid their reputations became among customers, bankers, government officials, the wide range of personnel that was required for their operations. And the more solid their reputations became, obviously, the more substantial those operations could become. But Franklin and Armfield didn't just become a giant in the slave trading industry because company partners were brilliant entrepreneurs. They were lucky. They were lucky to be working in the right place at the right time. The first 5 or 6 years of the 1830s saw the biggest economic boom the United States had ever seen to that point in its history. And the heart of that boom lay in the land, slave, and cotton economies of the Lower South. The white population of the Lower South increased by roughly 700,000 people in the 1820s. It would increase by nearly 1 million more in the 1830s. And it was encouraged by federal government policies that forced Indian nations off the best cotton land on the continent, by banks that flooded the region with easy credit and cheap loans, and by cotton prices that nearly doubled between 1830 and 1835 alone. Demand for slaves skyrocketed accordingly, and so did profits for slave traders. In the 1830s, slave traders moved about as many people via the interstate slave trade as they had during the 1810s and 1820s put together. The number of people trafficked in the trade jumped by 85% from the 1820s to the 1830s. One scholar has calculated slave trader profit margins in the early to mid 1830s as ranging from 30 to 50%. Now, that was greater at any time before, other than a very brief moment in the late 1810s, and it was greater than would ever be seen again before the Civil War. So in short, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard may have done well in the slave trade whenever they started their business, but they also sat on top of larger structural changes that served their interests perfectly. Given the raging demand for enslaved people, the widespread availability of banking capital, they could not have done better than to have founded their company precisely when they did. And they couldn't have chosen a better time to shut it down than when they did either. For a variety of reasons, the partners wound company operations down in 1836, just months before the slave trade took another dramatic turn in its life cycle. The boom economy of the 1830s was a debt-fueled bubble economy. And when it came crashing down in the spring of 1837, it took the slave trade business with it, ravaging that business, just as it did most forms of commerce that depended on the currents of credit that flowed around the world. Now, enslaved people, of course, they suffered no matter what the economic circumstances of white people were. Thousands of enslaved people, tens of thousands, were sold to stave off bankruptcies during the Depression. But the slave trade itself actually drops by about 35% from the 1830s to the 1840s. And that drop probably disguises what was an even steeper decline in the late 1830s and early 1840s in particular. Because as the nation recovered from its economic debacle by the mid-1840s, the slave trade took off again. Now, it never quite took the same explosive shape that it had in the first half of the 1830s. But slaveholders didn't actually learn anything from the disaster that was the Panic of 1837. Instead, as the slaveholding portions of the United States expanded into new states like Texas, Arkansas, Florida, as slaveholders brought previously undeveloped regions of Louisiana and Mississippi into cultivation, demand for enslaved people took off again. In fact, white Southerners were so bullish about slavery's future, about the prospect of extending American sovereignty to places like Cuba and Central America, that slave prices, usually you could track them with the price of cotton. They rose and fell roughly as cotton prices did. But in the 1850s, slave prices became delinked from cotton prices. They simply skyrocketed upward. And as more and more slave traders jumped to capitalize on this seemingly irrational yet seemingly boundless demand, the number of enslaved people trafficked across state lines jumped again by 35%, reaching 250,000 people in the 1850s. And that was nearly as many people as had been trafficked in the 1830s. And it brought the total number of enslaved people caught up in the forced migrations of the 19th century to more than 1 million people in total. And yet, even as the slave trade boomed again, even as hundreds, perhaps thousands of men decided to try their hand at the slave trade business, even as new technologies, things like the railroad and the telegraph, they changed some things about how the business worked, particularly enabling the slave trade to spread deep into interior markets that had once been relatively isolated. Even as those things happened, the company model established by Issac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard that remained the basic template for the slave trade. Now, there were more large firms in the 1850s than there had been when Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard was the colossus of the slave trade. But nearly all of those big firms operated the way that company had: established headquarters in cities, regular advertising, reliance on shipping or rail travel, supplies provided by agents working on salary or on commission, and integration with sprawling credit and banking systems. Now, the companies functioned that way, sometimes because the men who led them had actually been associated with Franklin and Armfield. They formed a kind of slave trading business diaspora that was rooted in that company. But mostly the companies took that form because Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard had shown that the model worked. They may have left the business by the 1830s, but they were collecting debts from customers and bringing in revenues for years afterward. All three men ended up extravagantly wealthy and widely respected. Now, one of the ironies of their success, and those of the men who followed them, of course, was that the more the slave trade ballooned, the more it fed anti-slavery agitation against it. And that agitation would, in time, help bring about the final stage in the life of the trade, which was, of course, its demolition during the Civil War. That demolition began, appropriately enough, in Alexandria, where in May 1861, Union forces liberated the slave pen that had been John Armfield's headquarters. They confiscated it from Confederate cavalry who'd taken it over, and the U.S. Army began using the facility as a prison for deserting, drunken, or insubordinate Union soldiers, for a few Confederate prisoners, before ultimately converting it near the end of the war to portions of a hospital and to housing for a small number of freed people. But it would still be a few years after 1861 before the domestic slave trade in the United States ended for good and was put to the end it had long deserved. White Southerners clung to slavery to the very last. Slave traders offered their wares to the very end. There was a market in enslaved people inside the Confederacy, even as slavery itself collapsed, even as Confederate currency inflated to the point where it was practically useless. When the Union finally liberated Richmond in April 1865, they had to track down a slave trader who had chained the slaves still in his jail together and was trying to march them out of town in the hopes of selling them someplace else. He figured even in its death throes, the slave trade would still find a market somewhere. Now, I don't want to end by leaving the impression that the domestic slave trade was a Southern phenomenon alone. I mean, I've alluded to this several times already, right? The slave trade was something that was sanctioned by the federal government. It involved banks from all over the country. The cotton and sugar that was produced by enslaved people who'd been trafficked in the trade sat at the center of national and global economies. And the profits that were spun off, the asset and labor values of the enslaved circulated throughout the United States. And of course, the trauma, the dislocation, the fear of the slave trade, those things shaped the lives of Black people no matter where they lived. The slave trade may have taken place in the South, but in truth, the trade and its consequences were everywhere. In some ways, they still are. And slave traders like Issac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, they were just a few of the men who made that so. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to unshare my screen. I hope that some of you have questions. Chris, I'm going to turn this, I guess, back over to you. And I'm happy to take questions and talk first as long as we've got left.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. You do have lots of comments and questions in the live
Good.
stream. I'm going to start with a few of the comments.
Okay.
Where Renee Shakespeare says the work done at the Forks of the Road site in Natchez by Sir Boxley helped to highlight the domestic slave trade for the National Park Service. I invite everyone to visit and see the research that has been going on for 20 years now.
Maybe even more than 20. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Sir Boxley almost single-handedly kept this story alive. He was very helpful to me when I visited Natchez doing research. His work was amazing. And I've been talking to the folks at the National Park Service a little bit as they develop that site, and I'm really excited about what comes there next.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then, let's see. So Michael asks, early on in the book, you mention an episode in which the deceased bodies of enslaved people were dumped just outside of Natchez, leading to a policy ending sales of the enslaved within the city limits. Have you been able to track down where outside of Natchez that occurred? Did it take place north of the Forks of the Road or south of the city?
So it actually takes place in the city of Natchez. And this is why the city then bans the traders from operating within the boundaries of the city. This incident is in early 1833, and it's the reason why the slave trade in Natchez, in fact, moves to the Forks of the Road. The Forks of the Road was, at the time, about as close as you could get to the corporation line of the city of Natchez without actually being inside the corporation line. Now, Issac Franklin's original location was in what was, I guess, technically a suburb of Natchez. It wasn't in the original grid. It was in a development that was known as Williamsburg, but it was in the city limits proper. It's just north of the city. His facility was on what's now St. Catherine Street, at the I'm trying to remember what block it's in exactly. But I think, and this I'm not positive, I know where his location was. And on that location, to this day, there remains right next to it an empty lot with a ravine and a gully. And it's hard for me to believe Issac Franklin is dragging dead bodies all through the street in the middle of the night. I am almost positive, although I have no actual evidence of it, but I'm almost positive that what he's doing is he's essentially dumping the bodies in that ravine that I think is actually still there in Natchez.
My goodness. Judy Rosella asks, are there records with names of enslaved people on these brigs in Natchez or at the headquarters building in Virginia? From earlier in your talk there.
So the answer is yes, although not all of those names. One of the things about the fact that the federal government sanctions the slave trade is that they actually create customs regulations for the slave trade. So if you wanted to operate legally as a slave trader and bring people by ship, you had to create a manifest that described, that provided the names of all the people you were shipping, that provided their sex, their color, their subjective color, right? And their age, and their height as well. And essentially, if you can track down those manifests, you can know the names of all the people who were shipped to New Orleans. In New Orleans, you can get records of the sales that are made, so you can track when Issac Franklin sells people in the city of New Orleans, you can figure out who those people were sold to. Now, by process of elimination, you can figure out most of the names of the people who were then shipped to Natchez instead, because he sold probably some people in other places, but by and large, it's in those two cities. Now, in Natchez itself, that's where the records become much hazier. There's no systematic documentation of slave sales in Mississippi the way there was in Louisiana. So it's almost always impossible to know who people were sold to in Natchez. Sometimes you can track that down. If there's a if there were lawsuits involving people, for example, the names of those people will be recorded in the lawsuit.
Yeah.
But there's no systematic record of slave sales in the city. So that's a very long way of saying that, yes, you can find the names of a lot of the people that they shipped, not all of them. And you can figure out where, I track down slave sales in New Orleans, and they sell about 2,000 people in the city of New Orleans. So the rest of the people they sell are sold in Natchez. So the majority of the people, we don't know exactly what became of them, but you can get the names of who they were.
Okay. Shane Peterson asks if there are any woodcuts or presumably other illustrations of the forks of the road as an active slave sale site.
So not in the sense, I don't think that there are sort of drawings of the site, right? Being able to sort of see the physical location of it, at least not in the 1830s. There may be some by the 1850s. I'm not positive of that. But there are descriptions of it in travelers' accounts. There are a couple of maps that are drawn. There's one in particular that I can think of from the 1850s that's drawn by I think the city surveyor. I can't remember exactly who draws that map. So you can see sort of in the 1850s kind of where the physical location of buildings is, and you can read some descriptions of what those buildings look like. I don't think that there are woodcuts or photographs of the site that are contemporaneous, but I could be wrong about that. I do periodically come across these drawings and woodcuts that I had not seen before I published the book. So they may exist, I don't know. But there are definitely descriptions and maps.
Yeah. Sort of a wide-ranging question here. I'm going to let you choose which parts of it to address first. But Sarah Campbell asks, does your work fit into economic history? What makes this area ripe for historical study right now? Have new records become available? And then why are we seeing better the interconnectedness of the domestic slave trade in the larger U.S. economy?
So I'll take the first part first, I guess. So I do not consider myself an economic historian. I think this book, to the extent it's in that category, it probably falls more into business history than it does economic history. I don't do, a lot of, economists work a lot with statistics, a lot with mathematical formulas. They're asking different kinds of questions than the ones that I'm really interested in, and frankly, the ones that I'm really trained to do. I don't consider myself an economist in any way, shape, or form. And but I draw on the work of a lot of economic historians, obviously, and like I said, I think I'm asking different questions than a lot of them are asking, but some of them do very good work and very useful work. I don't know that there are a lot of new records that have come up. Sometimes it's sort of finding records that people have looked at and piecing them together in different ways. I can say that the Rice Ballard papers, which are enormously helpful and useful for a project like this, they are relatively new as archival records go. They really were not, people didn't even really know they existed until the 1990s. And the second accession of a big portion of those papers was put into the University of North Carolina, I think in the early 2000s. So those are relatively new records, although a lot of people have looked at them by this point. I think in terms of the second question, look, I think that this book is part of what anyone who's been paying attention will see as a new conversation that's reviving what is actually a very old conversation about the intersection of slavery and capitalism in the United States, about the role of slavery in the development of the United States. Like I said, it's a very old question. People have been talking in those terms for at least a century, if not more. That conversation has ebbed and flowed over time. I think it's come back with new research and new ways in the last maybe 15 or 20 years, maybe even less. And I think it's part of the larger conversation that Americans are having as they think about the impact of slavery, not merely as a Southern institution, which it was, but as an institution that played a role and that could not be disconnected from the rest of the American economy, American society, arguably the global economy. And I think this book is participating in that conversation, and hopefully shedding some new light on some aspects of it.
Yeah. This question, I think, is linked to when you were answering the earlier question about the bodies being dumped in the ravine. Pam Jr. asks, is there any connection with that to the Devil's Punch Bowl?
So not directly. The Devil's Punch Bowl is actually something I remember from my last book. So my last book was actually about the John Murrell imagined conspiracy in the 1830s. And the Devil's Punch Bowl is this. I mean, it's a real thing, but as a site where kind of criminals would go and supposedly sort of would, when they were slave stealers, they would often dump bodies in there if they needed to make their evidence disappear, right? If they couldn't actually sell the people they stole and they wanted to hide the evidence, they would dump them in the Devil's Punch Bowl. And I think there's actually there's I think it's an apocryphal story, but it's a widespread story that there are hundreds of bodies that were dumped there. I think in the 1860s, but I can't remember the details of that story. I've heard that story. It's not really connected to the Franklin story, other than in it's a kind of story that resonates with the Franklin story, right? So the idea that slave traders and that sort of nefarious white men would dump the bodies of enslaved people, or specifically, or black people generally, in that site, that may be linked in some way in that story, but it's not sort of directly connected in any historical way. Does that? I hope that answers that question.
Yeah.
I think that's what they're gesturing toward.
Allison Steiner asks if you can comment on the post-war reparations claimed by Ballard, Armfield, and Franklin's heirs from the United States.
Sure. So one of the things, obviously I do get asked from this book about the question of reparations a lot. The short answer that I have to that is that I think that this book and other work on slavery certainly justifies the legitimacy of the conversation about reparations. I'm not a scholar of reparations, so I don't pretend to know what the answer to that question is. But I can tell you that one thing that I did find in this book, which I didn't actually know going in, was that in some way, even though the enslaved people sold by Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard, and enslaved people in general, never received anything when emancipation came, right? They never received any financial compensation for stolen labor, for the trauma of their families being separated, for other sort of physical damages done, nothing, right? However, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard, all of their widows received reparations in some way or another. Rice Ballard dies in 1860. Issac Franklin dies in 1846. John Armfield dies in 1871. Now, Issac Franklin, when he dies, very long story, but ultimately his widow, Adelicia Franklin, inherits everything. Among the things she inherits are all of his plantations in Louisiana. During the Civil War, she has a cotton crop of several thousand bales of cotton that the Union blockaded, that the Confederacy told her she was supposed to burn, lest it fall into the hands of enemy forces. Instead, she plays both sides off of each other. She gets a permission from the Confederacy to move her cotton. She gets a Union gunboat to escort her cotton. And so she gets both sides of the Civil War to help her move 2,000 bales of cotton to Liverpool, where she sells them for between $1 and $2 million, right? Now, that was never supposed to happen, but she pulls that off. Rice Ballard's widow, after Rice Ballard retires, he and another business partner by a series of plantations with enslaved laborers, mostly in Louisiana and Mississippi, along the Mississippi River. And the U.S. Army, obviously, during the war, comes down the river, liberates those plantations, takes a lot of the cotton, sometimes keeps enslaved laborers on those plantations and has them sort of overseen by people who are hired by the Treasury Department, so the money would go into the U.S. Treasury. Rice Ballard's widow files for claims. She makes a claim against the U.S. government. She says, all this cotton was taken from me. I was always loyal, which she was not. Her second husband served in the Union Army, though, so she makes a claim through him and says, well, because he was a Union officer, that's my proof that we were actually loyal. She was not loyal. She was a supporter of the Confederacy. But the U.S. government paid her money for the things that had been taken from her. They give her the land back, and they actually pay her for some of the cotton they took. So she gets reparations. And finally, John Armfield. Now, you need to know that John Armfield, during the Civil War, not only was a supporter of the Confederacy, he actually paid to outfit a union of Confederate troops in Tennessee. However, during the war, he is sort of rolled over by sort of Union forces and Confederate marauders. He goes and takes a loyalty oath to the Union in 1863, and then has the nerve to go to the Treasury Department and say that all of his money that was taken out of the Bank of Louisiana in New Orleans is something that the Union government should pay back to him. Because he claimed he was always loyal, never supported the Confederacy. It's an outright lie. And his claim is turned down the first time. But in the 1880s, the executor of his will puts the claim forward again on behalf of Armfield's widow, and they pay her. They pay her $18,000, which is about $500,000 today. So she also receives reparations. So all three widows of these slave traders are basically helped by the federal government to make sure that they're made right financially.
What sort of taxes did southern states or any states impose on slave traders?
So that varies. It varies place to place.
Yeah.
So there were some places like Washington City, which is now all that's left of Washington, D.C., was Washington City,
yeah.
And Richmond, Virginia, and a few other places that actually made slave traders buy licenses. So if you wanted to operate legally, you had to pay a few $100s in a license to operate. New Orleans at some point, I think, also comes up with a licensing system. There were other places, and Natchez does this, that actually had taxes on slave sales. And there's a small reel of microfilm at the state library that records some of the taxes that were paid by slave traders. So, and there are other places that do that too, but it's inconsistent. It really varies city to city, state to state, as to whether there would be taxes paid on slave sales.
But in some instances, there was a straight sales tax on the sale of human beings.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Jackie Killian.
And that's another way, of course, sorry to interrupt, but
No.
that's another way that that city and state governments benefit from the slave trade.
Right.
They're basically skimming a little bit off the top.
Right.
So,
Jackie Killian asks, during your research, did you observe Armfield, Franklin, and Ballard specifically looking to buy or trade enslaved people with specific skills, such as blacksmith, carpentry, cooperage, other skilled traders, in addition to agricultural cultivation?
So when they would advertise, they would basically say they were such a big operation that they don't really specialize, right? They want to appeal to every possible customer that they could, and so they're buying almost anyone that they can. Now, they don't buy anyone who's made available to them. They pick and choose who they choose to purchase, but they know that in the markets that they are shipping people to, the majority of the enslaved who are in demand are going to be field workers, because that's how slavery worked in the lower South. However, in their advertisements, they say that they are looking for enslaved people of all ages, and they say that they're looking for I can't remember the exact language, but it's basically they're looking for field hands and also mechanics of all descriptions. And mechanics basically at the time meant somebody who who worked in a craft or a skill that had a specialized set of tools, right? Mechanism is where mechanic comes from. So that would take in carpenters, blacksmith, coopers, but also cooks, house servants, drivers. And of course, there's also a separate market in so-called fancy girls, right? Which is it's a sex trade, basically, that they're moving people for. So they're not looking for those people necessarily in particular, but when they get them, they also are aware of what their skills are, and they market them accordingly because they know that they can get more money for people who do have a specialized skill set.
Yeah. Could you describe how some of the holding pens and private jails operated by the slave traders looked and worked?
Sure. So again, those do vary somewhat. Some of them are really they're really mostly a jail. Yeah. Sometimes set up as with kind of individual cells, but usually, and this was true of the way jails operated in the early 19th century, it's usually just a giant cage or a pen. Sometimes people are particularly during the day, would not be kept literally behind bars. But they're usually, it's a sort of a big open space. Usually there's a big wall surrounding it, sometimes 10 feet high, sometimes 20. And the idea was basically to keep people from the outside seeing in, and to keep people on the inside from either seeing out or getting out. Now, some of these facilities could be a lot more elaborate than that. I mean, you could see the one in Alexandria, for example, has a big fancy house in the front. You couldn't actually see the pen behind it. But Armfield's pen, which was again one of the more elaborate ones in the Upper South, the house had offices in it. It had a parlor where Armfield would sort of entertain customers. You would go out the back door, and you would basically see a yard for enslaved men and a yard for enslaved women and children. In the back of the pen there was basically a barracks where people would be kept behind bars at night, where they would sleep, often in chains. Armfield also had buildings that served as a kitchen, a tailor shop, an infirmary for when people got sick. So Armfield's is sort of a kind of all-purpose operation, but some of these jails are much more stripped down than that, and they're really just a place to keep people in a pen until you could sell them.
Alvin Blakes asks, do you see a connection between Issac Franklin and the creation of Angola Plantation Penitentiary and the current criminal justice system?
So that's a great question. So just as a little bit of background on that, the short version of that is that one of Issac Franklin's Louisiana plantations was called Angola. He called it Angola. And it became that and several other plantations and a lot more land adjacent to it became what's now the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. They kept that name as the site of it. And in the early years of Angola, when it was penitentiary, prisoners were kept in housing that had been used for enslaved people, either by Franklin or by his widow. The first kind of superintendent of the penitentiary, Samuel James, basically made all his money through convict leasing, by leasing out enslaved. They weren't formally people who would have been formerly enslaved convicts to various industries. And look, to this day, Angola, the population at Angola is overwhelmingly black. A disproportionate number of people are kept there for life sentences. Some of the labor that they are forced to do is labor in fields where they're overseen by white men on horseback. I'm not one who thinks that there's a sort of an easy linear connection from slavery to mass incarceration, right? There's a lot of sort of places that you had to go to get from point A to point B. But that connection is there. It's there in sort of how it looks and how it feels. It's there in terms of the idea of of surveillance of black laborers who are going to be forced to work for the rest of their lives. What I argue in the book is that, what slave traders contribute to things like mass incarceration is the idea that they help get white Americans accustomed to seeing black people in chains, behind bars, trafficked across the landscape. That was something that by 1860, a lot of white Americans understood that, like, oh, yes, that's okay to do to black people. And I think that that's something that feeling long outlasts slavery and emancipation. And I do think that we still see we see a resonance of that with mass incarceration, even if I don't see a sort of direct connection of point A to point B.
I'm reminded in the chat that the 1856 Forks of the Road map that you mentioned earlier has been digitized by the Department of Archives and History and is now available for viewing by anyone on the website. So for folks who are interested in that.
I'm pretty sure that's where I got the copy that's in the book. It's certainly from the archives.
Yeah. So for folks who are interested in seeing that, you can go to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History website.
Yeah, and the digitized version looks great. You can blow it up and get really close.
Right.
It's fantastic.
Join us next week when Bob Meyer will be with us to talk about his book. Joshua, this was a terrific program. Thank you so much. The book is The Ledger and the Chain: How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America. We've been talking about doing a program together for a while. I'm glad it has finally happened, and we'll look forward to working more with you in the future.
I'd love to. Next time in person.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.